A Zoom call bleeds through the wall. You're trying to write one sentence and you can hear every click of every keyboard. A tap on your shoulder. Quick question. A Slack ping. Every few minutes, something pulls you back to zero. Eventually, you book a conference room just to think. A room designed for 6, used by 1, because it's the only place in the building with a door. Offices have been redesigned dozens of times. So why does it keep feeling like this? To understand where we are, you have to go back to where this started. And it starts ugly. By 1960, 1/3 of American workers had moved into the gleaming downtown skyscrapers that were reshaping every major city. And what they found inside looked a lot like the factory floors their white-collar jobs were supposed to be an escape from. Rows of identical desks packed into the middle of the floor. Managers and executives along the windows and edges, elevated, visible. Typewriters hammering. Accounting machines clicking and whirring. It looked like a factory, and it ran like one too. A theorist named Frederick Winslow Taylor had spent years timing men with shovels to find the single fastest way to move dirt. And what he built from that, Taylorism, treated workers as components. Find the one best method, strip out every other motion, measure the output. Companies applied it to clerks and accountants anyway. The stopwatch just traded the steel mill for the skyscraper. A freelance designer from Colorado named Robert Probst looked at all of this and thought it was insane. In 1958, he ended up at the Aspen Design Conference, where he met the president of Herman Miller, the furniture company. Herman Miller wanted to expand beyond its iconic Eames chairs and Noguchi tables. Probst wanted a platform. They suited each other. At Herman Miller's Michigan offices, Probst started watching how people actually worked, not how companies assumed they worked. He'd been reading about a German movement called Bürolandschaft, office landscape, which argued that offices should change and grow, not stay stuck in a rigid grid. To him, forcing someone to sit in one spot, doing one task all day, wasn't just bad for business. It was miserable. Probst made one fatal mistake. He gave managers a tool they could weaponize. But that comes later. In 1964, he and furniture designer George Nelson unveiled the Action Office, and it looked nothing like what offices had been. Standing desks, a semi-enclosed rosewood phone booth for private calls, a rolling cast aluminum desk for papers you needed to see rather than file away. Every surface was built for movement between tasks rather than static, sitting in one configuration all day. The idea was simple. People work better when they can move around. A little mess keeps ideas in sight, and workers need a bit of privacy without feeling trapped in a box. It was the closest anyone had come to designing an office around the person actually sitting in it. Companies looked at it and passed. The materials were too expensive. The concept was too radical. Nobody wanted to spend that kind of money on workers at the bottom of the corporate ladder. Probst came back 4 years later with Action Office 2. The rosewood was gone. The cast aluminum was gone. Cheaper plastics and laminates replaced them. George Nelson had clashed badly enough with Probst that he got removed from the project entirely, and the standing desk became a normal desk. The phone booth disappeared. What remained, and what turned out to matter enormously, was a system of lightweight, fabric-covered panels that could be moved around to create semi-private spaces. Probst was explicit about how they were supposed to work. Configure them as a half hexagon, like a small amphitheater. Keep them open. Do not, under any circumstances, push them into right angles and box people in. He said it clearly and repeatedly. His own documentation stated it. Companies did the opposite. The panels went to right angles. Spaces shrank. The cubicle was born. Herman Miller's sales jumped by $10 million after Action Office 2 launched, and the knockoffs came fast. Most of them kept the fabric walls, but dropped the mobility entirely, because fixed panels were cheaper to install and easier to pack tightly. George Nelson, who'd been pushed off the project, watched all of this and wrote a memo in 1970 that didn't mince words. Action Office 2, he wrote, was admirable for planners looking for ways of cramming in a maximum number of bodies. Robert Probst held out longer, still defending the underlying concept. But by 1997, he gave an interview to the New York Times, where he called the cubicle landscape monolithic insanity. He spent the last years of his life distancing himself from the thing his work had produced. Then came the tape measure. The recession of the late 1980s accelerated everything. American businesses cut over 1 million jobs between 1990 and 1992. The workers who stayed inherited smaller spaces, fewer resources, and the constant, low-level awareness that they were replaceable. The cubicle, which started as a design for partial privacy and movement, became the physical symbol of that disposability. Everything you owned at work fit in a banker's box. That was the point. A space designed to be cleared out in 10 minutes because the company needed you to know that was always an option. Dilbert ran in newspapers. Office space put it on screen. The hatred wasn't really about the furniture. It was about what the furniture said about how companies viewed the people inside it. So, Silicon Valley arrived in the 2000s with an antidote. Long shared tables, no walls at all. Mark Zuckerberg sitting in the middle of his employees to prove he wasn't above them. The pitch was collaboration, spontaneous interactions, collision culture, the idea that proximity would generate creativity, and that the cubicle's isolation had been strangling it. When Facebook took over the old Sun Microsystems building in Menlo Park, they doubled the number of people in the same square footage. But here's where the collaboration promise broke. Harvard Business School found face-to-face interaction dropped 70% at companies that switched to open plans. People stopped talking across desks and started angling their screens away, avoiding eye contact, building invisible walls out of body language because the actual walls were gone. That's why the most expensive rooms in the building, the big conference rooms that sit empty most of the day, get booked by one person who just wants to close a door. It's a design failure hiding in plain sight. Companies built large, shared spaces to force collaboration, and workers used those spaces to escape it. Meanwhile, the square footage kept shrinking. In 2010, the average office gave each worker 225 square feet. By 2017, it was 151. The open office wasn't just a philosophy. It was a cost-cutting measure wearing a philosophy as a disguise. Today, we have sofas that look like living rooms, inflatable pods to hide in, and $300 noise-canceling headphones that do the job a fabric wall used to do. The aesthetic changes with every decade. The factory doesn't go anywhere. It just learns to look like something else. Libraries figured this out decades ago. Cafes figured it out. Different spaces for different kinds of work. No single layout pretending to serve every need at once. The office never got there, not because the right furniture hadn't been invented yet, but because the people buying the furniture were never the ones sitting in it. Every redesign optimized for the business case first, never for the people actually working in it. The office never failed to work. It just never worked for you.